Morning, everyone. Did you notice that he forgot to mention one person who's been instrumental in helping to organize this? A round of applause for Clay Doobie, please. As I'm sure all of you are, I'm very much looking forward to this morning's sessions, and I'm very confident about that. I know that with cooking, for example, if you get the right ingredients, it's hard to go wrong, and I think that's the same with panel presentations, and I think you will agree. When I introduce them, we have indeed some excellent ingredients here for a terrific repas. The issue of development in China and China's growth inevitably raises important questions about whether indeed it is sustainable. I think that Ambassador Roy's comments last night and his very telling depictions of the scale of China, and if we really come to bear in this, if we think about China continuing development, approaching anything such as the standards that we have in the United States or in Western Europe with respect to energy consumption, it raises some really fundamental questions about whether indeed it is sustainable. And in that context, issues of energy and the environment come to the fore. And so for that reason, we were very pleased to be able to assemble this group to help us get a discussion going about those issues. And so I will introduce them here all briefly in advance, proceeding from Elizabeth Economy here, who is closest to me. Elizabeth is the Senior Fellow and Director of Asian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her most recent book bears very well on the topic that we're addressing here, The River Runs Black, The Environmental Challenge to China's Future. And this book won the International Convention on Asia Scholars Award for Best Book in Social Sciences recently. She writes, publishes frequently in Foreign Affairs, New York Times, other major publications, and is an author that many of us, whose writings many of us have encountered, and it's a real pleasure to welcome her here today. Next in line is Richard Edmonds, who is a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, where he is also affiliated with the Center for East Asian Studies there. He is the author of book on Macau, which is where my wife is from, so I feel an affiliation already. And related specifically to this panel, he's also authored a book that is a survey on the environmental degradation and protection in China. So he will surely have some insights, including those that he draws from a book that he's edited recently on managing the Chinese environment. And he is currently co-editing a book that looks at the role of NGOs in environmental protection in China. David Zweig is with the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where he is Associate Dean for the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. He is the author of 4 books, including Internationalizing China, Domestic Interests and Global Linkages, Globalization and China's Reforms, and with respect to the topic that we're addressing this morning, he is co-author of an article, China's Global Search for Oil, that appeared recently in Foreign Affairs. Carolyn Cartier is a member of the faculty here at USC, where she is also acting chair for the Department of Geography, and I understand has just returned from a conference up north on geography. We're very pleased that she could return here to help provide some discussion of the topic this morning. She is the author of Globalizing South China and co-author with Lawrence Ma, co-editor with Lawrence Ma of the Chinese book on the Chinese diaspora. So I think you'll agree we have an excellent panel. And so without further ado, I'd like to call upon Dr. Economy to get us started.
Thank you very much, Professor Hekala, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me here, Clay and Howard Gilman, and of course my good and old friend, dear friend, Dan Lynch, who I think is probably primarily responsible for my being here today. I'm going to talk about China and the global environment, and sorry, just set this down here. China, the global environment, and I'm going to begin my remarks with a quick sort of overview of where China stands in terms of its domestic environmental practices, because how it balances or how it integrates environmental protection with development has everything to do, of course, with the impact that the country exerts on the global environment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chinese government response to its environmental challenges and focus specifically on global climate change, and finally make a few remarks about where the environment fits into the U.S. relationship with China, both where it fits and where maybe it ought to fit. So first, just a very brief environmental snapshot. I think over the past few years, there's been an enormous amount of media attention here in the United States paid to China's environment. And so some of these facts and figures have really, I think, become quite popularized. I think that's important. So China has, in terms of air quality, 16 of the world's 20 most polluted cities. About a third of its agricultural land and a quarter of its land are affected by acid rain. Acid rain, you probably know, can erode buildings, affects fisheries and agriculture. This is primarily due to China's reliance on coal for about 67% of its energy, and also the inefficiencies in this use of coal and its relatively low utilization of emission control technology. If you were to ask, I think, any Chinese official, and probably most of the Chinese general population, what is the most serious environmental challenge you face, however, they would say water. Although China has the 6th largest freshwater reserves in the world, because of the way this water is distributed and because of overutilization and other inefficiencies as well, China only has a quarter of the world's per capita average availability of water. Consumption has been increasing at a rate of 3 to 4% per year. You know, as the Chinese get wealthier, they want to take showers, they have dishwashers and washing machines, they buy second homes, they want to water their lawns, they like to play golf. In many ways, their consumption patterns look an awful lot like those of us here in the United States, unfortunately. So consumption is increasing. At the same time, China loses about 20% of its water through leaky pipes. So there are opportunities here for some fairly dramatic change in the situation with some technical fixes. Pollution is also a very serious problem. About 70% of the water that runs through China's major urban areas is unfit for fishing or drinking, and about 30% of the water through China's 7 major river systems and its tributaries is not even fit for agriculture industry. Only about, in a survey that the State Environmental Protection Administration did of some 500 or so cities, only 23% of the wastewater that they tested was treated adequately. So again, you see both in the air and the water issue, you have problems of low utilization of pollution control technology, as well as inefficiencies in the system. Finally, on land, China is somewhat under a quarter desert. Sort of this is what the Chinese say. And the desert is advancing at a rate of 1,900 square miles per year. I think why this matters most is seen by the statement of a Chinese Vice Minister of the State Environmental Protection Administration, who said that he anticipates between 2000 and 2020 or so, you could see as many as 150 million environmental migrants in China. These are people who are forced to move because they no longer have access to enough water, for their farming or for grazing their animals, or even sometimes you can see the pictures in the media where their villages are entirely subsumed in these sandstorms and by this encroaching desert. So the point is really that the environment is under stress on every front in China. And as you look outward over the next 20 years, I think the challenges become even greater because China is very, very rapidly developing a system of transport that will, or seems to, about to be, to rely a lot on private cars. It's, constructing some 50,000 miles of highways. It has very significant difficulty in controlling local investment into heavy, inefficient industry. And it has this process of urbanization underway. And urban residents, they want to urbanize 300 million people between 2000 and 2020. And urban residents use about 2.5 times more energy than their rural counterparts. So again, offers enormous opportunities to do things differently right now. They're just building cities upon cities. Shanghai's going to have 10 satellite cities or something like that. So really opportunities to improve building energy efficiency, wastewater treatment, develop state-of-the-art public transportation system. The real question is this what we're going to see as we look out over the next 15, 20 years? Now, in terms of the global environment, I think the issue that's received most attention certainly has been the issue of climate change, where China has for a while now been the second largest contributor to global climate change after the United States. The International Energy Agency came out last fall and said, well, actually China's going to surpass the U.S. as the largest contributor of carbon dioxide, one of the key greenhouse gases by 2009. Now all of a sudden, people are coming out and saying, actually, they're going to surpass us this year, 2007. So global climate change is probably the issue now, and particularly in Washington, that has captivated people. And I can tell you in Congress, they are having, every single committee is having hearings on this issue of climate change. The Budget Committee, International Relations Committee, there's a whole new committee that's being formed. Anyway, every week now there are hearings on climate change, and China is an important element within these discussions about what the United States should do. Timber. China is the largest importer of illegally logged timber in the world. For those of you who visited Shanghai, for example, they have these flooring companies and floorboards, plywood, paper and pulp products. China imports about 80% of its timber from Brazil. 80% of the timber that it imports from Brazil is illegal. Same is true of Gabon. Overall, about somewhere around 50% of the timber that it imports from throughout Asia is also illegally gathered. And this can be either because the Chinese companies are not paying taxes to the government, so illegal you have to define. It can be either because they're not paying taxes or because they're logging in areas that they're not supposed to be logging. And finally, I think when I was working on the paper, the greatest surprise for me was that China has now become, according to the World Wildlife Fund, the largest polluter of the Pacific Ocean. And this is really because of the Yangtze River Delta and all of the small-scale, or not so small-scale, factories that simply dump their wastewater and sewage directly into the small river, the rivers and tributaries anyway that feed into the Yangtze. So, in fact, I will mention one last thing that I didn't discuss in the paper, and this is something that David has worked on, which is China's resource quest. And I think one of the challenges that the world is going to face is that as Chinese multinationals go abroad into Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa, what kind of environmental practices are they going to be bringing with them? And we've already seen in a number of African countries, in Peru, et cetera, that the way that Chinese mining companies do business domestically is not so great, and on the global front is also not so great, and produces some backlash against the Chinese. Okay, so what are the Chinese doing about all of this? I think it's fair to say that President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao have very dramatically ratcheted up the amount of attention that they're paying to the environment. It really is night and day from Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, who were much more about sort of go-go economic, unfettered economic growth. I think they had the idea of trickle-down economics. And I think President Hu, Premier Wen, they see the dark side of this very rapid economic growth, and part of that relates to the environment. It's not that they are environmentalists per se, I would say. I don't think there's an Al Gore within the Chinese Politburo. However, they see the way the environment affects a range of other political, economic, and social issues. And this is why it matters so very much. So, for example, with regard to the economy, there are a lot of numbers floating out around here. So you can take them for what they're worth. But I will say in June, China's State Environmental Protection Administration, one of the vice ministers, said that environmental degradation and pollution cost the Chinese economy the equivalent of 10% of its GDP annually. This is from perhaps crops that are lost because of water pollution, or $35 billion lost because factories don't have enough water to run in certain parts of the country at certain times, or missed days of work because people are sick. So that, I think, is significant. You also begin to see what I call changing local economies. Areas within China, say in Shanghai, for example, where reportedly over 2,000 lakes and small rivers have dried up over the past few decades. That has a profound impact on hydropower, on the potential for continued industrial development. So these are things that actually you can't redress. People always say, well, China's just in the path of industrialization, and they're going to get to a certain point, their wealth is going to get here, and then they're going to go back and fix it all up the same way we did. Well, we haven't anyway, but the idea is that they're going to do that. But the truth is that in some cases, you've moved past the point of being able to go back and take care of the degradation and pollution that you've brought to bear by your development. Public health is another issue that is rising on the Chinese leadership agenda. And here, both the Chinese and the World Bank have said that respiratory disease related to air pollution causes over 400,000 premature deaths in China annually. I think far more serious, however, is the issue of water pollution, where the Ministry of Water Resources says that close to half the population drinks contaminated water on a daily basis, and 190 million people, which is quite a striking number, 190 million people drink water that's so contaminated that it's making them sick. And that's why you see these articles by Jim Yardley of the New York Times and others about these cancer villages, and the Chinese themselves report on this, these cancer villages all along China's rivers and tributaries where the rate of cancer and tumors, stunted growth, diminished IQs, all of these things are much higher than the norm. And I think this is an extremely serious issue that the Chinese government not quite grappling with aggressively enough. Finally, I'd say the issue of social unrest. The environment is one of the leading causes of social unrest in the country. China Daily reported that there were 50,000 environmental disputes in China in 2005. It doesn't define dispute, so not quite clear what it means. Some disputes are small scale, and some, such as in Zhejiang, can engage 30 to 40,000 Chinese protesting 13 chemical factories that are polluting the water and spoiling their crops and making their children sick. It can range. But I think the point for the Chinese leadership is that the environment contributes to one of their great sort of social challenges. Finally, I think the Olympics clearly is having an impact on the thinking of the Chinese leaders, particularly now. We're getting closer and closer to 2008. And I think there's a good deal of anxiety in Beijing about whether or not they're going to be able to produce a clean Olympics and a green Olympics, which is what they promised back in 2001. On the global front, I think China increasingly is becoming aware, and part of this also relates to the Olympics, I think, of the reputational issues associated with the environment. So, for example, you saw Mia Farrow on a slightly different issue talk about Darfur as and China as the genocide Olympics. I think this has a very direct and significant impact on the thinking of the Chinese leadership, because the Olympics are China's coming out party, and they will be spectacular, but they won't be spectacular. Oh my God, I only have 5 minutes? All right, so anyway, okay, they won't be spectacular. All right, I'll skip that. Okay, so let's move on. China and climate change. I think you counted his time and mine. All right, so.
No, actually, I'm keeping time too.
I told you.
Right.
Okay, anyway, all right, I got a lot of sense of humor here. Okay, so what is China doing? If we look at the way China is approaching climate change, I think it's a very good way to understand how China more generally approaches environmental issues and global environmental issues, which is to say you tend to get very grand, important, and impressive targets being set by Beijing. So, for example, on the issue of climate but also really it's directed toward domestic issues. They've promised 16% of their energy mix will be made up by renewables by 2015. They're going to reduce the energy intensity of their production by 20% by 2010. They've promised to invest $200 billion in renewable energies. They've set very tough and excellent building energy efficiency codes as they move forward in this urbanization process. At the same time, they've said, and this is coming out now in their climate change report, which is just being published, that they do not see and are not interested in thinking about caps, any sort of caps on emissions until 2050. They are thinking about reducing the carbon content of their energy, but they're not thinking about caps. So you get these great targets, which are often not met. So, for example, they've already missed the first year of their reduction of energy intensity target. Right. So they said they do 20% by 2010, but they've already missed their first 2006 year target. You also begin to see some of the more proactive coastal areas starting to take initiatives on their own. So, for example, Shenzhen has said that in all its new construction, it wants solar water heaters for buildings that are above 12 stories. All right. China also engages the international community quite aggressively. China has signed on to Kyoto, which is something we have not done, and it's a very active participant in the clean development mechanism, which is the way in which the international community takes action in China to reduce their targets, the advanced industrialized countries and the companies, basically transferring technology and investment so you can expand wind power farms, for example, in China, and do this kind of thing. China has 60% of the global volume of carbon credits that are engaged in this program. So much more than, say, Brazil or India or other. Very aggressive, forward-thinking activity in China. And then it's also a partner with the United States in the Asia-Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate. And there are many other things. And then the last part of China's usual environmental strategy is it does have room for civil society and NGOs and the media. One of the most, frankly, exciting aspects of China's environmental protection effort today is at this level. And many people are surprised by this. On the issue of climate change, this is not such a big issue. There aren't very many NGOs in China that are Chinese NGOs that are actually directed in this effort. They're focused on domestic environmental protection effort. Okay, so within the U.S. And China relationship, what do we see? I think that there are both some very positive things that are going on in terms of cooperation in this Asia-Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate, which at this point rests largely in the research stage. There are U.S. companies going to China with a lot of technologies that could make Chinese buildings more energy efficient. NRDC, and the Department of Energy are working with the Chinese government in Beijing to make their Olympic Village LEED certified, so top of the line energy efficient buildings there. So there are all these kinds of activities going on. At the same time, what you really have are these two countries engaged in an unholy alliance of not being willing to set any targets or timetables for reducing their emissions. And each of them uses the other as an excuse. So what you hear in Washington is, we're not going to sign on to anything if the Chinese and the Indians aren't going to do it. Why should we? And what you hear in China is, we're not doing anything unless the Americans do, well, because they're not going to do anything anyway. But we're not, the U.S. has no credibility, in essence. So how do we make it work? My last points. I think the first thing that has to happen to get a more proactive sort of climate change policy out of China is that the U.S. has to step up to the plate. Again, we've had absolutely no credibility in talking to the Chinese about what they ought to be doing on this issue unless we're prepared to do something. I think that there are ways in which China very much wants to take advantage of U.S. technologies on energy efficiency. At the same time, there are issues of intellectual property rights protection that the Chinese need to address. Orville Schell, I don't know where you are, Orville, had an op-ed in the Post that proposed a fund of $25 billion where the U.S. could support sort of the transfer of these technologies. At the same time, you're looking at China now with $1 trillion or more in foreign currency reserves. China can buy some of these companies. It wants access to these large wind power turbines. It can just buy this Italian company that makes it if they want to. So I think China's growing wealth also offers them opportunities to do more. Finally, I think what's missing really in China, and what I think escapes a lot of people when they operate up here and think about sort of grand scale ideas or sort of the excitement and enthusiasm about what China can do with regard to this issue, is that what China really needs to do is on the ground at the local level, and that is to put in a system of incentives and disincentives, both political and economic, that make it easy for local officials and businesses to do the right thing. And that means changing the pricing of their natural resources. It means raising the fines for polluting enterprises, and it means enforcement. And so when people say, what more can we do, what more can we do, I think, first of all, it's important to understand that the bulk of the responsibility and where you're really going to get the change, the necessary change, is going to be at the local level. And it's going to be by changing the system of incentives. And at the same time, we do have a role to play there because we can work with them on things like rule of law and implementation issues. So there is more that we can do, but it may be in slightly different ways than I think we're typically used to thinking about. Okay, thank you.